After we buried my husband, my son took me for a quiet drive through the countryside. 20 minutes in, he pulled over, handed me a suitcase, and said, "This is where you get off." No phone, no money, just silence and dust. But what he didn't know, what they both never saw coming, was that I had buried more than a husband that week. I buried the version of me who forgave everything. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about what happens when a mother stops being silent and reclaims everything they tried to take from her. My name is Eleanor Jameson. I'm 68 years old. I've been called a mother, a wife, a neighbor, a woman with strong hands and a soft voice. But lately, I feel like a stranger in the life I built. 3 weeks ago, I buried my husband, David Jameson. He died the way he lived, quietly, with dignity wrapped in layers of calm, even when pain took hold of his body. Pancreatic cancer doesn't announce itself with violence. It creeps in, makes a home behind your ribs, and when it's ready, it takes everything. It gave us 14 months, enough time for last words, not enough time for peace. We were married for 42 years. David and I met in college, fell in love slowly like the first frost on the orchard trees we would one day tend. He used to joke that I married him for the land, 20 acres of wild, neglected Vermont soil his father had left behind. But it was the way he looked at that land that made me love him, like it had a soul, like it deserved to be understood. Together, we turned those 20 acres into Jameson Orchards, an organic apple farm known throughout the state. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was honest. We raised 2 children under those apple trees, Michael and Rachel. They knew the land like their own backyard because it was. They learned to walk between the rows of McIntosh and Honeycrisp, scraped their knees climbing the old wooden ladder to help us pick in September. They named the barn cats. They fed the goats. They were part of this place. Or so I thought. I suppose I should have seen it coming. The visits became less frequent after they left for college. Michael went into finance, suits, flights, screens. Rachel tried several careers: yoga instructor, wellness blogger, a stint selling essential oils. David and I didn't always understand them, but we supported them. We paid Rachel's rent more than once. We helped Michael with his first condo. That's what parents do. When David got sick, we didn't tell them right away. It was his idea. Let them live a little longer without this shadow, he'd said one night lying in our creaky farmhouse bed, his voice slurred by morphine. I nodded. I always did when he asked me gently. But I knew our children. I knew what they had become, what they had forgotten. When they finally came, Michael in a rental SUV from Boston, Rachel with 3 oversized suitcases and a tote full of supplements, they brought no casseroles, no comfort. Only questions. Legal ones. "Have you thought about downsizing, Mom?" Michael asked the evening after the funeral, his fingers tapping against a whiskey glass. "Running a farm at your age can't be easy." Rachel sat beside him, scrolling her phone with one manicured hand. "We were talking," she said, "and we think it might be best to settle things quickly. Dad would have wanted that. Settle. Like the soil beneath our orchard after spring rain. Like debts. Like disputes. They were already carving up our life like an estate sale. I should have screamed. I didn't." I nodded again. My hands, still sore from carrying David's casket to the hillside plot he chose himself, trembled in my lap. They spoke about the orchard like a liability, the house like clutter, my future like a scheduling conflict. I tried to remind them, "Your father and I built this with our hands. 40 years of pruning and grafting, compost and sweat. This land is our legacy." Michael looked up then, and for a moment I thought he heard me. But what he said was, "This Dad and I spoke before he passed. He wanted Rachel and me to take over. He left the business to us. You'll be taken care of course. Of course." I stared at the paper he slid toward me, neatly printed, not on our family lawyer's letterhead, but on Michael's firm's stationery. Rachel chimed in. "The developers are offering $7 million. It's the smart move, Mom. $7 million for our trees, our soil, our history." I couldn't speak. Instead, I remembered. I remembered when Michael broke his arm falling from the tractor and I stayed up all night icing his fevered forehead. I remembered when Rachel's first boyfriend cheated on her and I sat in the dark with her for hours braiding her hair and listening. I remembered all the birthday cakes I baked, The sandwiches I cut into heart shapes, the rides to soccer and dance class, the nights I watched from the porch, proud of who they were becoming. But they weren't those children anymore. They were strangers wearing my son and daughter's faces. Later that night, I lay in our bed alone, staring at the ceiling David had patched for the 5th time last spring. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and the lotion he used. In the silence, I let my hand rest on his side of the bed and whispered, "They're not who we thought." Outside, the wind moved through the trees we planted the year Michael was born. The orchard was quiet, but beneath the soil I could feel something stirring. A shift, a fracture, maybe even a beginning. Because sometimes when everything falls apart, that's when you finally hear the truth. And I was ready to listen. The next morning, the sun rose pale and silent over the orchard. I made coffee the old way on the stove with the enamel kettle David had chipped 20 years ago and refused to throw out. I took my time, hoping the smell of home would soften the air. Hoping my children, still asleep upstairs, might remember the scent of mornings when they were loved and little. I had set 2 extra places at the kitchen table, not just for breakfast, but for memories, for decency, for them to see this was still home. Instead, they came down dressed for a meeting. Michael wore one of those crisp button-ups he favored in Boston, too perfect for a Vermont farmhouse. Rachel trailed behind in cashmere and perfume, tapping out a text with her thumbs as she walked. Neither looked at the spread I'd laid out. Blueberry muffins, sliced apples from the cold cellar eggs still warm from the hens out back. "We should talk," Michael said, already pulling out a manila folder. My hand tightened around my coffee mug. Rachel didn't even sit. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "We just want what's best for everyone, Mom." I didn't respond. I waited. Michael opened the folder. Inside, a will, cleanly typed, notarized. Not on Vincent's letterhead, our family attorney for over 3 decades, but branded with the logo of Michael's firm. He slid it across the table. "This is what Dad signed last October," he said. "He wanted Rachel and me to take over the business, modernize it, scale up. There's a developer offering $7 million. I blinked. "He signed this in October?" He nodded. "While he was on morphine." Michael stiffened. He was lucid. His hands trembled too much to hold a teacup. "But this signature looks flawless." Rachel finally looked up from her phone. "Mom, are we really doing this? Picking a fight over details. You know what Dad wanted?" "No, Rachel," I said quietly. "I know what your father believed in, and he would never sell this land to developers." There was a pause. Then Rachel said the sentence that snapped something in me. "You need a place that suits your age, Mom. This house is too much." I looked at her, at the glossy hair, the carefully contoured face, and I saw none of the child I once rocked through asthma attacks sitting up all night just to count her breaths. I remembered sleeping upright in a hospital chair, Rachel's tiny hand gripping my finger as she wheezed. I remembered singing to her in whispers when her lungs rattled with each inhale. And now the same daughter said I was too old for the home I'd carried her through. I pushed the document away. "Where's Vincent's signature?" "He wasn't available," Michael said smoothly. "I handled it through a colleague. You had your father sign away his life's work while dying. Without his lawyer. Without me." Michael sighed like I was being difficult on purpose. "Mom, don't make this emotional." "It is emotional, Michael." He flinched at the sharpness in my voice. Rachel chimed in again. "You've done so much, Mom. No one's denying that. But it's time for a new chapter for all of us. You can live somewhere with friends' activities. We'll make sure you're comfortable." "Comfortable," I repeated, as if I were an aging pet to be rehomed. "That's not fair," Michael said. "Isn't it?" I stood up slowly. My hands trembled not with weakness, but with a fury I hadn't known I was still capable of. "I built this orchard with your father. I paid the bills. I packed your school lunches. I wiped your noses, read you bedtime stories, stayed up all night when you had the flu. This land raised you." Neither spoke. Michael finally said, "We're not trying to erase that, but business is business." I stared at him. At the man who once chased fireflies through this orchard, who buried his first dog under the big Macintosh tree with tears streaming down his cheeks. I had raised a boy who cared, and somehow I'd ended up with this cold stranger in tailored slacks. "I want to see the original will," I said. Rachel exchanged a look with Michael. "It's time to move forward, Mom. We already have a buyer lined up. I want to see Vincent's will, not this." Michael picked up the folder and tucked it away with a practiced calm. "That won't be necessary. This one is binding." And there it was, the line drawn. They weren't asking for my blessing. They were telling me to move aside. Rachel finally walked over and placed her hand on my shoulder. "You'll thank us one day." I looked at her. At the daughter I once carried for 9 hours of labor without screaming. And I said nothing. Later that night in the quiet of my room, I opened the drawer of David's nightstand. There, beneath his reading glasses and a small wooden cross he kept even though he wasn't religious, was a letter. His handwriting slow and uneven. Dated September. It was addressed to me, and in that moment I knew I had to fight. The car was too quiet. Michael drove with both hands on the wheel, his jaw clenched tight. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone, as if we weren't headed to the supposed next chapter of my life. I sat in the back seat of the rented SUV, hands folded in my lap, like a child being driven to boarding school. We called ahead. Michael said at last, not looking back. "The place has a great reputation. Sunny Pines. Activities, communal dinners, even walking trails." I didn't respond. Rachel glanced at me through the rearview mirror. "You'll love it, Mom. You've been isolated out here for too long. It's time to be around people again." I looked out the window. The orchards rolled by branches still bare, waiting for the promise of spring. The trees David and I had grafted with our own hands. The soil we'd nurtured for decades. The house that stood like a sentinel at the top of the hill watching me leave. Except this wasn't a visit. This was exile. 15 minutes passed in silence before Michael made an unexpected turn. We veered off the highway onto County Road 36, a long, winding stretch bordered by farmland and broken fences. No traffic, no homes in sight. My stomach turned. "This doesn't lead to Sunny Pines," I said. "No," Michael replied calmly, pulling onto the gravel shoulder. The SUV crunched to a stop. Rachel turned around in her seat, her expression a shade too bright. "We packed a few essentials for you. Just clothes and medication. The rest will have delivered." I blinked. Delivered where Michael shifted into park and turned off the engine. "Here," he said. "This is where you get off, Mom." I thought I'd misheard. "Excuse me?" He turned around, his face unreadable. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. We can't move forward with the sale if you're still living in the house. This is cleaner." I stared at him, willing the boy I once raised to appear in his eyes. But he was gone, replaced by this man with expensive shoes and a rehearsed plan. Rachel bit her lip. "There's a gas station about 5 miles up. You can call someone, or maybe one of your quilting friends will come get you." The door beside me unlocked with a mechanical click. I didn't move. "You're leaving me on the side of the road," I whispered. "Don't be dramatic," Michael snapped. "You have your medication, your ID. You'll be fine. You're not helpless." I looked at Rachel, searching for a sliver of decency. "I didn't know he was going to do this," she mumbled. "Not until this morning." But she didn't object. She never did. I opened the door slowly and stepped out. The wind bit at my cheeks. The gravel shifted beneath my shoes. My small suitcase, packed not with care but with calculation, was handed to me like an afterthought. Michael put the car back into drive. "We'll be in touch." And then they were gone. No hugs, no goodbyes, just taillights shrinking into the horizon until the curve of the road swallowed them whole. I stood alone. The air smelled of damp earth and cold regret. I tightened my grip on the suitcase, and my purse heart pounding not with fear but with clarity. They thought I had nothing. They were wrong. I crouched by the ditch and opened my purse. My fingers, though stiff with age, moved with purpose. First, my medication essential, yes, but not all. Next, my passport wrapped in an old grocery receipt, still valid. Then, carefully folded and hidden in the seam of an inner pocket, I withdrew a thin envelope. Inside the original deed to 20 acres of orchard land purchased in my maiden name, before David and I were even married. Unencumbered, unsuspected, untouchable. Those 20 acres contained the most fertile soil on the property, and more importantly, exclusive water access. Without it, the developers would be stuck with dry dirt and broken promises. They thought they were pushing me aside, but they just stepped off the edge of a cliff, and I was holding the rope. The walk to town would take hours. My shoes weren't made for distance, and my joints ached with each step. But I didn't stop. Each mile unraveled the shock. Each step burned the betrayal into resolve. Michael and Rachel had crossed a line, not just by stealing land, not just by forging documents, but by forgetting who I was. I had bled for them, carried them, sacrificed my body, my time, my dreams. I had sat by Rachel's bed every night she struggled to breathe, counting the seconds between inhalations. I had driven 2 hours through a snowstorm to bring Michael the backpack he forgot at college, even after he cursed at me for hovering. And now they had left me like garbage on the side of the road. But they didn't know me not anymore. They saw a mother, a widow, a liability. They forgot I was still a woman, a strategist, a fighter. I adjusted the strap on my shoulder, straightened my spine, and kept walking toward town, toward truth, toward justice. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. By the time I saw the familiar green and white sign that marked the edge of Maple Falls, nearly 3 hours had passed since my children left me on the side of County Road 36. My legs ached, my lower back screamed, the soles of my feet throbbed inside shoes made for funerals, not country roads. But I didn't slow down. Every step pulled me further from the woman they expected me to be, a woman who would cry, beg, plead for scraps of decency. No, that woman was gone. The spring sun had begun to sink low, painting the sky in shades of tangerine and rust. Ahead, nestled between the gas station and the hardware store, sat the Flour Jar, a tiny bakery that had outlived every grocery chain that tried to replace it. Its blue awning was faded now, but the smell of fresh bread drifting from its chimney was exactly as I remembered. Lucille Brennan stood behind the counter, her hair tucked under the same paisley bandana she'd worn since we were both young wives. She looked up from the register, and for a moment her mouth hung open. Eleanor. I must have looked like hell, mud-caked hems, windburned cheeks, and a suitcase dragging behind me like the last thread of an old life. But Lucille didn't ask questions. She simply came around the counter and hugged me. "Come on," she said gently, guiding me into the back room where the warmth of ovens wrapped around us like a blanket. "Sit down." What happened, I didn't answer right away. She poured tea without asking how I liked it, just knew. I cupped the mug in my hands and stared down at the rising steam. "They left me," I said finally. Lucille blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Michael and Rachel pulled over and told me to get out of the car. They said the house and business were theirs now, that I'd be more comfortable somewhere else." Lucille's eyes narrowed. "That's not betrayal. That's cruelty." I thought about forgiving them. I whispered more to the tea than to her. On the walk here, I even wrote it out in my head, a letter. Told myself they were just scared, pressured, grieving. That maybe if I showed them grace, they'd come back to me. Lucille was quiet. But then I remembered Rachel's face. That bright, empty smile. The way she watched me step out of the car like I was being dropped off at a hotel. And Michael, how calm he was. Cold. I took a slow sip of tea. Forgiveness was the language of the woman they left behind. Lucille nodded once. "So what now?" Now. That was the question. I reached into my purse and retrieved my old prepaid cell phone. It hadn't been used in months, but David insisted we always keep one for emergencies. "Old tech still works," he'd say with a wink. I powered it on and dialed the one number I still knew by heart. It rang only once. Vincent Holloway speaking. His voice hadn't changed, still deep steady. He was David's friend first and then ours. He handled our business contracts, land titles, even drew up our first will. "Vincent," I said. "It's Eleanor." A pause. "Eleanor. I've been trying to reach you since the reading. I was surprised you weren't there." "What reading?" Another pause. Longer. "Michael presented a will after the funeral. Something didn't sit right with me. The signature, the language. I've been digging, but I didn't want to act until I knew where you were. They left me on the roadside, Vincent. Said the house and orchard were theirs now. I had a feeling, he said grimly. Do you still have what you and David called the insurance policy? I looked down at my purse and smiled faintly. Yes. Then come to my office in the morning. We'll start there. I ended the call, my fingers trembling, but not from fear, from control, from power, from the steady realization that I had not lost. I had been set free. Back in Lucille's kitchen, I retrieved the envelope, carefully unfolded the deed, 20 acres in my maiden name purchased before I took David's, before Jameson Orchards had a name. It included the East Grove, the main well, and the spring-fed irrigation line that no developer could build without. That land had been my quiet rebellion. David's idea after a bad year, when the bank almost took everything. Let's put this piece in your name, he'd said. So we always have something they can't touch. Now it would be the anchor of everything. Lucille leaned over and peered at the paper. That's the good land, she said. Your Honeycrisp row, the oldest trees. I nodded. And the only water rights. Holy hell, she whispered. They have no idea. No, I said. They really don't. I slept that night in the tiny room above Lucille's bakery, in a bed that creaked and smelled of cinnamon and old wood. I lay awake for a while watching the moonlight shift across the ceiling, not crying, not mourning, planning. They had left me with nothing, thinking that would be the end. But tomorrow I would begin again, not as their mother, not as a victim, as Eleanor Jameson, woman, widow, landowner. And for the first time in a long time, I was no longer someone's burden. I was my own beginning. Morning came with the scent of fresh bread seeping up through the floorboards from Lucille's bakery. I rose with a clarity I hadn't known in weeks. The betrayal had cut deep, but something else had begun to rise through the cracks. Purpose. By 9:00 a.m., I stood in the second-floor office of Vincent Holloway, our family attorney for over 3 decades. His building, a weathered Victorian overlooking Main Street, had served as the town's legal hub longer than I'd been married. Vincent greeted me at the door. He looked older than I remembered, his once black hair, now entirely silver, but his eyes were sharp, watchful. Let's get started, I said before sitting down. He nodded, and I laid the original deed to the East 20 acres on his desk. Still intact, he murmured, scanning it. And the water rights? Critical. I met his gaze. I want the business accounts frozen, I want the developer blocked, and I want Michael and Rachel to feel what it's like to lose something they thought they owned. You'll need leverage, he said. You already have the land, but let's go further. We spent the next hour assembling the framework. An emergency injunction to freeze all estate and business assets, a formal challenge to the forged will Michael had presented, a petition to the State Agricultural Board enforcing land use restrictions we had quietly filed years ago, and perhaps most effectively, a story. That afternoon, I walked 2 blocks down to the Milestone Gazette, our local newspaper. The editor, Sophie Delgado, had once been David's second cousin, and more importantly, someone who respected the truth. Her office smelled of ink and dusty archives. She looked up as I entered, eyes widening. Eleanor? She asked. I have a story, I said, laying the forged will and original deed on her desk. It's about elder abuse, about inheritance fraud, and about a family farm being sold off behind a widow's back. Her brow arched, then furrowed as she read. Oh, I'll print it, she said finally. Front page. Vincent handled the bank. Within hours, Harold Winters, the regional manager at First Vermont Trust, had frozen all orchard-related accounts pending legal review. My father worked this orchard when he was 16, Harold told me over the phone. Your husband gave him his first paycheck. I'll do what I can. By dusk, I had spoken with Martin Kessler, the county's agricultural advisor. He'd worked with David and me for over 15 years. I remember the conservation filings, he said. The spring-fed acres are protected. If the developer so much as digs without approval, they'll face heavy fines. He added with a chuckle, and I wouldn't mind seeing those big city types squirm a bit. That evening I returned to Lucille's, my steps slower, but my heart steady. She was waiting with a glass of iced tea and an envelope. From Thomas Winters, she said, handing it to me. Harold's son. Assistant District Attorney now. Says he's reviewing your case. Lucille sat beside me as I opened the letter. You're not alone in this, she said. You never were. You just forgot. I looked at her and saw what I hadn't seen clearly before: how much people had been watching. Not to gossip, but to remember, to keep record, to protect. It wasn't just about my orchard. It was about what it stood for. David and I had donated 10% of every year's harvest to local food banks. We employed teens during the summer, paid above minimum wage. We never sprayed pesticides that could harm the bees. We hosted school tours, sponsored 4-H, repaired the old community bell tower without ever putting our name on it. We had lived quietly, but not invisibly, and now that quiet legacy was roaring back to life. The next morning, Michael called, not to apologize, to panic. Mom, he said through clenched teeth, why are the accounts frozen? The buyers are pulling out. This is going to destroy everything. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't scream. I simply said, then it's working. By noon, the Gazette had published the article, Heirs Betrayal, Orchard Widow Challenges Forged Will Blocks Developer Takeover. The photo was of me standing beneath the old red barn arms, crossed head high. By sundown, people began stopping by Lucille's bakery, not for croissants or bread, but to ask what they could do. A retired judge offered advice. The high school debate team volunteered to help scan old documents. A woman I hadn't spoken to in years handed me a binder of saved newsletters from the orchard's early days, just in case I needed them in court. They didn't want drama. They wanted justice. And more than that, they wanted to stand behind someone who had lived with quiet dignity and who now refused to be erased. That night, I sat on the bench outside Lucille's shop and stared up at the stars. My children had tried to leave me with nothing. But in trying to take everything, they had revealed what they could never possess. My name, my integrity, my home, and my town. It hadn't turned its back. It was holding the line. They arrived exactly at 3:57 p.m., 3 minutes early. Michael and Rachel stood just outside Vincent Holloway's law office, tension radiating off them like heat waves off blacktop. Michael's shirt was wrinkled, his jaw dark with stubble. Rachel wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and her once perfect manicure was chipped at the edges. They looked like people unraveling. I was already seated at the long oak conference table when they walked in, flanked by Vincent on one side and Robert Claiborne, David's college roommate turned real estate litigator, on the other. Rachel paused when she saw Robert, visibly startled. Is that? She began. Yes, I said, cutting her off. That's the lawyer whose firm helped your father protect our land 30 years ago. The same firm that now represents me. Michael's lips pressed into a hard line. He sat down without a word. Robert opened a folder and slid 2 thick packets of paper across the table. These documents, he said, calmly outline the terms of your full renunciation. You will both acknowledge that the revised will was forged and that all legal rights to Jameson Orchards and the family estate revert to Mrs. Eleanor Jameson. In exchange, no criminal charges will be filed for fraud, elder abuse, or attempted unlawful transfer of property. Rachel's fingers trembled as she reached for the papers. This says we lose everything. Yes, I said simply. But you said, Michael began, his voice a mixture of disbelief and wounded pride. You said you'd make sure we were taken care of. No, I said. I said I would make sure justice was served. This is that. Rachel took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were red-rimmed mascara smudged. Mom, please, she whispered. I made mistakes. I let Michael push me into things, but I didn't want to hurt you. I'm sorry. Tears streamed down her face. Once those tears would have broken me. Once I would have taken her hand, soothed her, forgiven her in the same breath she betrayed me. But not now. Do you remember? I said when you were 8 and couldn't breathe in the middle of the night, when I sat by your bed for hours, counting every breath, singing to you because you were too scared to sleep? She nodded, sobbing silently. I forgave everything back then. The tantrums, the slamming doors, even the years of silence when you thought I was too small town for your world. I forgave it all because I believed that love, real love, deserved patience. Rachel buried her face in her hands. But that woman, your mother, the one who forgave you everything, she died on County Road 36. The day you both left me there without a phone or a cent. That's when she stopped existing. I looked at Michael. I don't care if it was your idea or hers, you executed it together. You used my grief, my trust, and your father's memory as a weapon. And now you expect mercy. He didn't speak. Vincent cleared his throat gently. You're both free to decline the agreement, of course. But I remind you that in doing so, we will proceed with full prosecution. And we have more than enough evidence. Michael took the pen. His signature was shaky. Rachel signed after him, tears still falling. When it was done, Robert gathered the papers, tucked them into his briefcase, and nodded at me. Congratulations, he said quietly. Rachel looked up. Her voice cracked. What happens now? I stood slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. Now I said you leave town. Today. If I see either of you again, I will not hesitate to pursue every legal avenue available to me. The only reason you're walking out of here with clean records is because I choose not to carry your consequences any longer. Michael opened his mouth as if to argue, then thought better of it. Rachel stood on unsteady legs. Will you ever forgive me? She asked. I looked her in the eyes, the same eyes I once kissed goodnight, and said with more calm than I thought I possessed, forgiveness is not something I owe you. Closure is. And this is it. They left without another word. Through the office window, I watched them cross the street in separate directions. Rachel to her dusty red convertible, Michael to his rented car. No hug, no goodbye, not even a glance toward each other. Two children who had learned that some doors once closed do not reopen. Vincent placed the signed documents into his safe, then turned to me. It's done. But I shook my head. No, I said. Now comes the real work. He smiled understanding. Justice had been served. But now came the rebuilding. Not of property, not of relationships, but of self. 2 weeks had passed since Michael and Rachel signed their renunciations and left town. The orchard had grown quieter without them, not just in sound, but in spirit. And yet for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel lonely. The land had always responded best to care, and it mirrored me now, wounded yes, but already healing beneath the surface. I needed help, not with paperwork or press releases, with the trees, with the earth itself. The kind of help that understood sweat and soil and silence, not board meetings and buzzwords. That's when I thought of Lisa Morales. She was the daughter of my oldest friend Anna, who had passed 3 years prior. Lisa had grown up visiting the orchard every summer, chasing chickens and naming every goat. David had taught her how to graft limbs, how to tell good soil by smell alone. Her laughter had echoed through these trees before my own children decided they had outgrown them. I called her on a Thursday morning. She answered on the first ring. Lisa, I said, this is Eleanor Jameson. A pause, then a smile I could hear through the phone. Mama E. I was just thinking about you. That's what she called me, Mama E, always had. Even when she was 10 and covered in apple juice, or 23 and trying to decide whether to finish her degree or follow her boyfriend to Oregon. I explained the situation in brief. The orchard was mine again, the legal battle was over, but the land needed new hands. Young hands, hands that respected roots. She arrived 3 days later in a beat-up truck ponytail, messy, wearing overalls, and a smile that made the orchard look younger just by standing in it. I'm not looking for charity, she said immediately, setting her bag down on the porch. I'll earn my keep. You always did, I replied. From that day forward, the orchard breathed differently. We rose at dawn. She worked the east rows while I managed the irrigation lines. We replanted lost patches. We checked for signs of spring pests. She knew when to speak and when to let the morning birdsong fill the space between us. And when she called out to me, her voice always had the same affectionate tone. Mama E, come look at this. She revived the neglected compost beds, rediscovered our old logbook system, and suggested we reintroduce the heirloom varieties David and I had grown in our first-year apples with names like Roxbury Russet and Ashmead's Kernel. One morning, While we pruned a forgotten row of Honeycrisp trees, she stopped mid-snip and said, "You know, I always wished you were my real mom." The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they hurt, but because they didn't. I smiled, placing a hand on her arm. "You were always mine, Lisa. Maybe not by blood, but by choice." Her eyes misted, but she nodded. From that point forward, she became more than a helper. She became a partner. She brought ideas, small-scale agritourism school tours, orchard yoga, even a Saturday market using our barn as a co-op space for local vendors. But more than her energy, it was her presence that changed things. At lunch, we sat under the same willow David had planted when Rachel turned 12. We ate sandwiches and shared stories. She told me about Anna's final days. I told her about my own mother's way of canning preserves, so tight the lids popped like applause. One evening, she brought out an old photo of her and David taken during the orchard's 20th anniversary. They were laughing, Lisa barely 12. David in his suspenders, a ribbon pinned to his chest that read, "Boss Man of the Year." "I keep this in my glove box," she said. "He was the first man who told me I was smart enough to do real work." I placed my hand on the picture, fingers trembling just a little. "He would have been proud of you. I hope I make you proud too. You already have." That night after she went to bed in the cottage beside the barn, the one we'd cleared out together, I stood at the edge of the orchard and watched the trees sway in the wind. Rachel had called twice since signing the documents. I hadn't picked up. Her last message had ended with the words, "I miss you, Mom." But I didn't return the call. Because motherhood isn't just about who calls you mom. It's about who shows up when the harvest is hard, who carries buckets beside you when the sun is merciless, who listens when you're too tired to speak, and somehow understands the silence anyway. And some daughters, you find them when you least expect to. Or maybe they find you. Either way, Lisa wasn't a replacement. She was proof that love grows again, even after loss. And under the shade of those same trees that had once witnessed betrayal, something new had taken root, something stronger, something chosen. The orchard was humming again, not just with bees or birdsong or the rustle of branches in the wind, but with life, real life. Children's laughter in the distance, the clang of old tools put to use, and the kind of joy that doesn't need to be loud to be full. That summer, I opened the Jameson Agricultural Learning Program using a portion of the orchard's east field. Yes, the same 20 acres that nearly slipped through my fingers as an outdoor classroom for local elementary schools. The first day, a dozen children spilled out of a yellow school bus and ran between the trees as if they'd stumbled into a fairy tale. Their teacher, Mrs. Evans, beamed. "They've never seen a real farm before, not like this." We'd built simple stations under shaded trellises, soil samples, seed tables, compost bins, and irrigation lines labeled with colorful signs. Lisa handled the composting demo. I led the soil talk. I stood beside a wheelbarrow holding a clump of dark, moist earth in my gloved hand. "Anyone know what this is?" I asked. "Dirt," a boy shouted. "Wrong," I said, smiling. "This is soil. Dirt is what you track into your house. Soil is alive. It's where life begins. And if you want something to grow, apples, pumpkins, people, you have to care for the soil." A little girl with glasses raised her hand. "How do you care for it?" I bent down, meeting her gaze, by listening to it, feeding it what it needs, giving it time to rest, protecting it from harm. You care for it the way you'd care for someone you love. The children fell quiet, nodding as if I'd just told them a secret worth keeping. Later that afternoon, I watched them kneel with tiny shovels planting radish seeds in neat rows. One boy named his sprout Captain Crunch. Another whispered to the soil like it was a friend. Behind them, the orchard stretched wide and proud, still scarred but thriving. A few weeks later, with Lisa's help, I established the David Jameson Memorial Scholarship, a fund for local students pursuing careers in sustainable agriculture. We started small, just 2 recipients a year, but it was enough to ignite something. At the launch event, I read a speech David had once scribbled on the back of a receipt, a line he used whenever our harvest failed or a frost hit late. "You don't measure a season by its yield, but by what it teaches you to endure." That night I stood beneath the barn's rafters watching families eat together at long wooden tables set with baskets of our apples, fresh bread from Lucille's bakery, and preserves made by 3 generations of women. It was the first community harvest festival we'd hosted in over a decade, this time, not just as a celebration of the orchard's survival, but of its purpose. I moved slowly between tables greeted by handshakes, hugs, and quiet thank yous. Parents told me their kids talked about the farm as if it were magical. Retirees who had once worked here as teens shared old stories and offered to volunteer again. Vendors sold handmade jam and crafts under the barn's eaves, where Michael once parked his flashy rental car to finalize betrayal. But none of that mattered now. This was my version of justice. Not a courtroom, not a punishment, a harvest. A generation that knew how to plant, to preserve, to pass things on without taking them apart. And amid the warm noise, I caught sight of Lisa, helping one of the children find their parents. She wore one of David's old denim work shirts and a name tag that simply read, Lisa, farm manager. The kid clutched a jar of honey and beamed up at her like she hung the moon. My throat tightened. She saw me and waved. Hey, Mama E, we've got 3 sign-ups for the fall tour already. I waved back, my heart quietly full. Later that evening, as the last lanterns dimmed and the final crates were loaded into trucks, I sat on the porch in David's old rocking chair. The night air was cool, scented with cider and hay. I thought of everything I had lost and everything I had gained. No one talks about what happens after revenge, after justice, as if the story ends there. But it doesn't, not really, because once the dust settles, you're left with something fragile and sacred. A choice. You can stay angry, or you can build something new. I chose the latter, not because I'm a saint, not because I forgave, but because I believe in roots, in passing things down better than we found them, in legacy, not as wealth, but as worth. This land will outlive me. But maybe one of those school children, maybe even the little girl who asked about soil, will remember what I said and grow something of her own. And maybe someday she'll stand on her own land and teach someone else the same lesson, that the world only changes when we choose to plant what others tried to burn. 3 months later, I sat on the porch in David's old rocking chair, the same one he had sanded every spring and insisted would outlast both of us. It had. The orchard shimmered in late autumn gold. Leaves danced across the dirt path, swirling between the rows of trees, like they were showing off before winter claimed them. The air carried the scent of apples and cedarwood, with a chill that kissed your skin just enough to remind you time was moving. I held a leather-bound journal in my lap, a gift from Lisa, given to me without occasion. For when the words need somewhere to go, she'd said. So I wrote, not for a court or a headline or even my children. For me. The first entry was dated the morning after the festival, and today, as I turned the pages, I saw the slow unraveling of grief and fury, of fear and fire, now transformed into something steadier, something quiet and rooted. Freedom. That's what it feels like. Not giddy or wild. Not some grand Hollywood ending where the music swells and everyone claps. Just this, a porch, a journal, an orchard still standing, a woman still becoming. I hadn't heard from Michael since he walked out of Vincent's office, shoulders stiff, ego cracked. Word around town said he lost his position at the firm. Something about misconduct tied to the forged will. I wasn't surprised. Rachel, on the other hand, had messaged me 14 times since that day. I never responded. I read them once. I let each one sit a moment in my chest. The pleas, the apologies, the memories she tried to conjure back like old ghosts. Mom, I didn't know he'd do that. I miss the orchard. I miss you. I made a mistake. Please. But the truth is, I no longer feel anger. Only distance. And clarity. The love I gave them was never false. The childhoods I built for them, the scraped knees I bandaged, the birthday cakes, I stayed up late to frost the sacrifices I made without ever asking for anything back. They were real. That version of me was real. But somewhere along the way, They'd stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a placeholder, a safety net, a signature they could manipulate, a mother who'd always say yes, until I didn't, until I couldn't. And now I wasn't their mother. I was Eleanor Jameson, woman of the orchard keeper of the East Fields, teacher of soil and seed, sponsor of scholarships, and something else I had never allowed myself to claim whole. I didn't need their redemption. I had my own. Lisa stepped onto the porch carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to me and sat on the step legs tucked underneath her like she had as a child. The kids loved the apple cider workshop, she said. One of them asked if he could live in the barn. I gasped. Give him a rake and tell him we'll talk. She smiled, then looked up at me. You okay, Mama E? I am, I said. And I meant it. Not the brittle kind of okay you say when you're still bleeding. The real kind. The kind where you feel your breath in your chest and it doesn't ache. The kind where you sleep at night, not because you're exhausted, but because you're finally at peace. I looked out across the land. The barn glowed in the late light. A fox darted along the fence line. Somewhere a wind chime rang. Lisa was watching me. What are you thinking? I took a sip of tea, then leaned back in the rocker. I'm thinking, I said, that I spent my whole life giving things away, time, care, forgiveness, as if I owed them. And for a long time, I thought being a good mother meant never stopping. She stayed quiet. But now I know better, I continued. Now I know the truest thing I've ever learned. I looked at her steady and warm. I'm not their mother anymore. I'm a woman who chose herself, who chose peace over punishment, who chose life after loss. And I rocked. Slowly, quietly, like the trees in the wind. Lisa didn't speak. She didn't need to. Because sometimes when the right people sit beside you, silence becomes a kind of safety, not alone, just free. And that's where my story ends. Not with vengeance, not with reconciliation, but with a choice. A woman on her porch, her land intact, her voice reclaimed, her life finally her own.